Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all here today. Legend has it that Ernest Hemingway entered a short story contest, and Hemingway was famous for his concision, for his economy with words, and yet for his profound storytelling. And he won this short story competition with 6 words, 3 sentences. He simply wrote, "For sale, child's shoes, never worn." It's a good story, a story that speaks to grief, to trauma, to loss, to sadness associated with death, with separation, particularly of one so young and all that is encompassed by that. I think in John chapter 11 and verse 35 we have an equally or perhaps even more poignant verse, a verse equally associated with grief and trauma and loss. A verse that if we just pluck it out of its context, we can kind of think that it's a bit of a cute memory verse for kids, that you sort of want the memory verses that are short. And ironically enough, in the book of John, which is known for its long chapters, we have the shortest verse in the Bible. But to put the verse in its context, I think, is really important, and that's what we'll be looking at today in John chapter 11, and Abby has kindly read quite a bit of that context. And we're talking about Jesus weeping, and yet the context is him raising Lazarus. And so what's going on here? Well, we know from verse 5 of John chapter 11 and verse 36 of John chapter 11 that Jesus was close friends with Lazarus and with Mary and Martha, and that this was in addition to his apostles, obviously, and in addition to the multitudes that we see him. Here we have an insight into what constitutes Christ's private life during his ministry, constitutes the close companions that we all need, that he's able to retire with and to have that sort of different relationship to all the other people that he was encountering. We see in verse 33 that others were weeping over the death of Lazarus, and that this troubled Christ, that he, just as we also see someone crying and it's very difficult not to feel something. I imagine all of us have been to a funeral where we weren't, very close to the person who's passed away. Maybe we were, friends of the family or third cousins or whatever it might be. And yet I would imagine that pretty much all of us have found a moment in a funeral, perhaps in the eulogy or, the passing of the coffin or wherever it might be, where we all kind of get stuck in the throat and the eyes start to moisten, and we start to feel the emotion of the occasion and the emotion of others who are suffering this loss. And so Christ himself obviously was very close to Lazarus, but also close to others who are feeling this moment. And so we see in verse 38, likewise, that we see more groaning, more. We're told that Jesus groaned in himself. And again, I think we understand what lies behind those words, that language, that to groan is to really something guttural, something that comes from a deep emotional point. It takes a lot to sort of elicit weeping. This isn't sort of a tear forming at the corner of the eye. This is that sobbing, that state that I think all of us recognize, but fortunately I think we don't really get to all that often. And so we have quite simply a friend of Jesus and a friend of Jesus' friends dying, and this is causing Jesus to weep. What does this tell us about Christ? I think there's a couple of important things that we can draw out. The first is that Christ isn't some sort of emotionless automaton. That Christ is human, that Christ has empathy, that Christ has compassion, that Christ has care, that Christ has love. And you might think, well, duh, obviously, we know that. But I think one of the dangers with Christ and with Christianity is that Christ gets twisted and refracted in so many different ways, and so much gets lumped on, and so much gets cut away from Christ. And Christ almost becomes this brand, and it becomes an icon that we stick on the front of a building, or that we sort of argue about in all sorts of spheres. But we kind of remove ourselves more and more and more from the reality of Christ, from Christ who spoke words, from Christ who gave us principles to live by, from the Christ who died, who felt these things, who lived and experienced and empathized the same things that we do. And so Christ isn't an icon. Christ is the living, breathing, feeling person that we see in Scripture. And so this is a testimony to the fullness of Christ's humanity. And we see also the duality of Christ here, in that he is also all God. He's also divine, and he demonstrates this. And we've been looking throughout this study of John at the different signs and the way in which those signs testify to who Christ is, and to the support that it gives to the authority of who he says he is. And so here we see him exercising the power over life, the power over mortality. Isn't it remarkable that he effectively knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and yet he still weeps over him? I mean, if he was sort of at a remove, if this was all just rote, if this was all just going through the steps until the cross, or whatever it might be, surely we would not have this little verse inserted here of Jesus weeping. In fact, I think that what this speaks to is the story of John. It's the story of the Gospels. It's the story of the Bible. And I don't mean story, I mean narrative description. This is Christ identifying with us so he can sacrifice for us. In the weeping, we see his humanity. And in the resurrection, we see his deity. And of course, encapsulated in that moment, I think, is profound enough. But surely this points us towards the cross, where we see both of those things encapsulated in the one moment. We see the humanity of Christ. We see the suffering that he goes through, the full brunt of sin being borne by his very mortal, very fragile, very anxious body. And yet we also see the power, don't we? We see the resurrection eternally, effectively. We see Christ exhibiting the power over life and death. And as much as in that moment it was a joyous occasion for everybody there to see, Lazarus alive again, their friend, the much more important, really, moment is in verse 25, where Christ reminds both Martha, but in effect all of us, that he is the resurrection and the life. Christ says, I am the resurrection and the life. And he links it to us, and he says, he who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And so Christ pointing towards this really crucial, universal fact, the reason that we have the Gospels, the reason that we have all of this explanation, is so that we can know and that we can believe that Christ lived, and that he died, and that he was raised again, and that means something for each and every one of us. And through his raising of Lazarus, he shows that, yes, he has the power over mortal life, but more importantly, it shows that he is, again, who he says he is. And he can heal a cripple, he can heal a blind person, he can heal life itself. But ultimately, what he can do is offer salvation. He can offer eternal life for our soul. And so, from the perspective of Christ, we can see this, but what are the lessons for us, apart from, again, pointing towards Christ, which we'll get to? We know that grief and trauma and loss abounds. We know in our immediate context, and we've seen particularly acute moments of these things, whether it is with the floods, whether it is with the warfare going on, whether it is with particular virus that has flooded through in the last couple of years. But we know that we don't need those moments to have grief and trauma and loss. We know that every day there are people in palliative care wards. We know there are every day people in GP clinics receiving diagnoses. We know every day there are police officers knocking on the front door and telling somebody news that will change their life. So maybe to solve grief, we just raise people from the dead, right? I mean, it worked for Lazarus and his friends. Briefly, though. We know that we don't get to raise Lazarus from the dead. We know that this is a one-time thing. We know that not everybody with blindness had it healed. We know not everybody with other disabilities were healed. We know that Christ was using this as examples, again, to demonstrate who he was, but to point to people to something even more important, even more profound. And would that work anyway? If we raised everybody from the dead, everybody would then all be happy forever, right? There'd be no grief, there'd be no suffering, there'd be no... Of course, it's an absurd proposition. We know that. Maybe there's other things that we can do for grief and trauma and loss. Maybe you can play in the Zambian football team in 2012. What's he talking about? In 1993, I'll fix that up in a moment. In 1993, the Zambian football team was traveling in a cargo plane that crashed off the coast of Gabon. It killed all 25 on board, the majority of the team and coaches. And the football team, their best player, he played in a club team in the Netherlands, and so he was flying to meet the team there from a different route. And this was, as you could imagine, a great loss to the country. Again, a great trauma, a great sadness. In 2012, the country of Gabon hosted the African Cup of Nations, and Zambia played in that tournament. They were certainly not one of the fancy teams. They didn't have the big stars that many other teams had. But they were able to, because they didn't have all of the stars, they were able to train as a team a lot more. And so they played, and they played with great success. And they made the final of that tournament. And the day before the final of that tournament, all of the players and all of the coaches went to the beachside where the plane that had crashed in 1993 had last crossed the land before it had plunged into the ocean. Each of the players there took a wreath of flowers, and all of the team were singing a song, and each player in turn went and put a wreath into the ocean to commemorate the players that had passed in that plane crash. The football player from Holland that had been their best player. He was now the president of the Zambian Football Association. And he said of the final, tomorrow we don't play with 11 players. We play with 11 players and the ghosts of the 11 players that had passed away. And he was confident of victory because of this entire context. As the game played out, they were playing against Ivory Coast, again a much more well-credentialed team. Ivory Coast had a penalty that they missed during the match. It went to penalties, as football games often do. The first 8 players scored their penalties. An Ivory Coast player missed, and then a Zambian player missed. An Ivory Coast player missed again, and then finally a Zambian player scored. As the penalties were being taken, each of the players, as they stand around the semicircle, were all singing the song that they sang previously at the beachside. Wouldn't it be lovely to be associated with a moment of national healing, to be able to score the penalty that paid honour? I don't know about you, but certainly for me, I don't get to win the African Cup of Nations in a penalty shootout, playing alongside the ghosts of players killed a generation before, thereby healing the grief of a nation. It's not the way the world works. Sometimes we just have these hardships. Sometimes we just have these things that are with us. And even winning the Cup of Nations doesn't bring back those players, doesn't return them to their mothers. We know that life is brief. We know that life is uncertain. We know that life at times is very difficult, and that we will suffer loss, and that we will suffer grief. And that to remove ourselves from that is effectively to remove ourselves from humankind, to remove ourselves from friends, to remove ourselves from family, to remove ourselves from feeling, from connections. Instead, what we get to do is what Christ got to do. We get to show empathy. We get to respond to the distress of others with genuine feeling and care and compassion. We get to weep when others weep, just as Christ wept when others wept. But also, and importantly, we get to point people towards Christ. Because yes, we suffer in this life, and yes, we're not pretending that grief is something that is easily solved or that any of that type of thing. But what we have to understand is what Christ declares in John 11 and verse 25. He is the resurrection and the life. And if you want any hope in this life, if you want anything to point towards to, then we point towards the life that Christ offers. We point towards that most profound of resurrections, not that of Lazarus, but of Christ himself, and what that means for each and every one of us. Thanks very much.